Neil, it's 67 days until the election. What are you doing?
Hanging out with you right now, but my goodness, that seems really not very far away.
And no, it really doesn't. And the number of calls and texts and emails I'm getting suggests that it's not very far away either. I have good news for you, though, which is that I've had a few subscribers that said they've just been kind of following along with the Substack, but now that you're on, they want to be part of it.
Well, that's amazing. Hello to all of them and appreciate that. We love our
Yeah,
fans.
we do love our fans, and you are, in fact, one of the most lovable political historians on the planet.
Well,
So,
I mean, there's not a lot of competition in the livability,
oh yeah,
in
oh
the
yeah.
lovability category.
Just look at Twitter and you can find
Exactly.
out. So we've got some interesting news this week. The Cook Political Report has moved North Carolina, which begins early voting next week, from lean Republican to toss up. And apparently, the rural counties are particularly in play right now. Nate Silver is predicting that if Harris wins North Carolina, she has a 97% chance of winning the election. But following Nate Silver is kind of a loser's game because he had a whole piece out today about how, well, there's not good information coming in about Pennsylvania. And so if she doesn't win Pennsylvania, things are all cattywampus. So, don't worry yourself over the polls. That being said, 538 has Kamala up 3.5 points nationally. Um, do you think we're seeing a convention bounce, or do you think that's pretty much where she was heading anyway, Neil?
Yeah, that doesn't, those numbers don't feel like a bounce, but it just seems like sort of overall trend developments. And I think we touched on this a little bit last week, but I do think this is sort of the new question of our new political age. Are the traditional metrics and the traditional even, um, I don't know, operations of a campaign season, do they work anymore? And I think one of those is like, does the convention actually move voters? And if it doesn't, if people don't really tune into it, who aren't already bought into the particular party they're supporting, then it's not surprising that one doesn't get a convention bounce afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think probably convention watching is like all other kinds of political media. We're all siloed anyway. It seems unlikely that somebody who's undecided is going to say, I'm going to spend 4 evenings watching a convention to figure out what to do.
Right.
Yeah. So it seems like the question of the week, however, and this is something that's been kind of bubbling under the surface that I thought you would be the perfect person to talk to about because you grew up in Florida, you live part of the year in Florida. The question is Florida in play? And I want to sketch a couple things for you before you answer, which is here's the big shift. In June, before Biden exited the race, Jen O'Malley Dillon, who is the head of the campaign, said that the Democrats were really not going to contest Florida. The last time a Democratic nominee won Florida was Barack Obama in 2012. And in July, before he left the race, Joe Biden was down 7 points. Now, Kamala Harris has closed that gap to between 4 and 5 points, which is not there yet. It's just better. But here's the big question. Voter registrations in Florida tipped Republican in 2021. There are almost a million more registered Republican voters than there are Democratic voters, but there are 3.5 million unaffiliated voters, a number that has held steady for about a decade. Now, redistricting makes most congressional seats safe for the GOP, but a statewide race, like a governor's race or Senate race or presidential race, is a whole different animal. So I just want to start by asking you, Neil, did you sense that shift happening in Florida after 2012 that was really becoming not just conservative, but Republican, which are obviously two different things?
Absolutely, yes. So, born and raised in Orlando area, all my family, all of my immediate family lives there. So, spend a lot of time there, a lot of time thinking about it. And it's interesting to think about growing up there and sort of imagining and remembering Florida being a little bit more of a toss-up state when I was growing up, although sort of leaning Republican, and the way it has become in the last 12 years. Deep red. And I think that you see that across the board in terms of like the Republican Party having a super majority in the legislature and a lock on the governorship. But all of this, of course, has become only more, I think, hypercharged in the COVID years,
Mhm.
and it feels like almost like a development that kind of can't be turned back. And so
Right.
that's why I think these numbers are really interesting, because your question about is Florida in play, it sort of begs the question of, well, what do we mean by in play? Is
Mhm.
Kamala Harris going to win Florida? I do not think so. Is the Harris campaign making Florida tight or even just competitive? Yes, it looks like it, and that matters for overall national election strategy, right? If Republicans suddenly have to put money back into Florida and pay a little bit more attention to the ground game there, that's a sort of thing that didn't seem like it would have to be done at all a couple months ago or a couple of weeks ago, when Biden's team was saying they weren't even going to really do anything in the state. So some interesting developments, but yes, I think that this is something that has really hardened in the last decade to 12 years. And to me, it still feels like a deeply Republican state, or at least in terms of election results.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think here are some of the things that people are looking at. One is that on July 25th, when Harris became the de facto nominee, she picked up 7,000 volunteers, and the campaign announced that they were opening 26 other offices in the state. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Biden had one office in Hillsborough County, but there really wasn't much going on. So there's activity. I remember 3 days after she was the de facto nominee, there was this demonstration in the villages.
Yeah.
With all of these elderly people in their golf carts with Harris signs. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the villages and why the villages are so important?
Yeah, so the Villages is this absolutely enormous retirement community about 45 minutes to the north of Orlando. I think I don't even know what the population is, but it's probably like around 100,000. It has been in recent years deeply, deeply red, really Trumpy. And so I think a lot of people were pointing to that footage as just like, wow, isn't this remarkable that even in the Villages, there might be engagement, enthusiasm, activity for Harris. The
Right.
question I wonder about, even with something like what we're seeing in the Villages, or that high volunteer turnout in Hillsborough County, um, is this new blood, new energy, new Democratic voters? Probably not. Or is it just a different political context than has been the case for the last couple of years in Florida, where
Right.
Democrats feel safe and excited about actually showing themselves publicly? I think it's more the latter, which is not nothing, right? But doesn't necessarily win in an election.
Yeah, I don't know whether I told you this, but when Nancy and I were taking a little spring break trip down to Anna Maria Island, which is near Bradenton, which I recommend to everyone, it's a lovely place to
Beautiful.
take a vacation. I wore my Joe Biden t-shirt into the grocery store, and I noticed I was getting a lot of stares. And finally, this woman came rushing up to me and said, "You are a very courageous person to wear that t-shirt here." And so, what you're saying about people who actually are closet Democrats feeling okay about
Right.
coming out strikes me as really important. So
Coming
let's
out Democrat. That'll be my next book, A History of Democrats in Florida.
That's fabulous. That's fabulous. But let's look at a couple of other races in Florida that could be really important here. Um, or just one, which is the Senate race between Republican Rick Scott, who is an election denier, and former Democratic Representative Debbie Mucarsel Powell, which Powell has moved to within 4 points, maybe 3 points since Harris announced. Is there a possibility that a state that would not vote for Biden might actually vote to replace Rick Scott?
That feels to me much more likely, because I think a couple of things here. First of all, Rick Scott is a slimy slime ball. I think most Floridians know that, although, when it comes to Florida Republicans, he's not alone in that category. But I do think in some ways he is maybe going to pay a price that Ron DeSantis didn't have to pay. So DeSantis won his reelection 2 years ago by a large margin, and since then has done the "don't say gay" stuff and a lot of antagonized Disney. Floridians really do not like DeSantis. His popularity numbers have really come down, and so I almost wonder if there's sort of like a backlash to DeSantis that shows up in the vote around Rick Scott. And if Scott loses, he'll lose by a narrow margin, which is how he's always won before. And so I think that'll also be in keeping with the fact that like he doesn't win handily at all. And so I think he could lose quite narrowly. If we had that result, though, I mean, Claire, what do you think this looks like? Or how do we understand this historically? A split ticket in the South? I mean, that actually fits within large voting patterns of the last half century or so of how Democrat Southerners have, often voted for Democrats at the state and local level, even as they voted for Republicans at the presidential level. I don't know if that's the right sort of historical context to put it in, but what do you think?
Well, I think that's very interesting. I mean, I remember in, when was it, 2022, and I was working on a campaign to replace, what's her name, the senator from Maine, Susan.
Olympia Snow or
No, not
Collins,
Olympia.
Susan Collins.
Susan Collins. Okay. How could I forget Susan Collins? Anyway, and Mainers were splitting their tickets.
Yeah,
So we had Democrats running the board except for Susan Collins and
right.
Mainers. And you could hear that when you were calling into the state. People would say, "Oh yes, I'm going to vote for the Democrat for governor." Oh no, 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 no! Of course, I'm voting for Susan Collins. So it may be that one of the things we're beginning to see come out of political polarization is not people becoming sort of more open to the other party more generally, but more open to a person in that party who is
Yeah.
conservative enough or liberal enough.
Well, I think so. The main example is really interesting, and I also think that, like, again, the sort of example of the history of the South of the last 50 years around voting on this, although not so much
Right,
in the last decade, but like the what I think is happening that's like feels like an inversion here is those examples in Maine and sort of the historical modern South are we continue to vote for incumbents from one party, but we vote for a different person at the national level. Whereas this would be the opposite of that, right?
right.
Am I getting that right?
Yeah,
There's so many moving pieces here. But I think you're right that like things are sort of being broken up and remade. Ultimately, though, I think the question is, what is it that's happening in Florida? Is it particular to Florida, or is it actually sort of a forerunner of what we're going to see nationally? And that this is actually revealing of a sort of a new Republican part or the Trump's Republican Party and what that means kind of consequentially around elections, right? Because there's also this stuff in Florida with the cannabis and the abortion referendum.
right.
Those are going to
Tell,
pass by huge margins, right?
yeah,
Those are way outpolling Democratic candidates in the state. And I think that there's a way in which Florida reelects Donald Trump, maybe even Rick Scott, narrowly is reelected. And also, cannabis is going to be made legal and abortion rights are going to be protected, or a small measure abortion right is going to be protected by a huge margin too, by bigger margins than Donald Trump wins. And what does that really show us? Is that actually the consequences of Trump's transformation of the Republican Party that is like disconnected from social conservatism and has this sort of I don't know how we're going to characterize it,
right.
But I think that this actually might be the first inklings of a new Republican Party that is truly Trumpist at the election in terms of policy and what Republican voters support.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then, of course, we will always see state variations. I think one of
Yeah,
the things I've been seeing in Florida is the business community being unhappy with DeSantis. And there's sort of two things I'm looking at. One is that he wanted to put hotels and pickleball courts and golf courses in 9 state preserves, beautiful, beautiful state preserves that would have had huge whacking hotels in the middle of it. Now,
yeah,
this is a thing that happens in Florida. They do
yeah.
this. I mean, Carl Hyacin writes about it all the time. But actually, the state planning board said no. And so they've had to go back to the drawing board on this. And that's kind of interesting to me. So DeSantis can no longer just do things because he wants them. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is apparently just in the last couple weeks, the state of Florida has removed all of the LGBT identified and LGBT friendly businesses from the state's tourism website, which, a lot of the gay conservatives that you write about are business people.
Right.
So, how's that going to play, do you think?
Yeah, business people in South Florida, right, that own small hotels and restaurants and bars and all the sorts of things that are connected to tourism, and that have marketed Florida as a destination for LGBTQ folks for decades. I think that this is of course, DeSantis has sort of backed away from it, said he didn't really know what was going on there, but yet this all lines up with what's happened time and time again in this state in recent years under his governorship. And this feels like a whitewashing really of and a whitewashing of the state, particularly removing any sort of LGBTQ references from any aspects of public life. And I think that like the pushback you're talking about is really important because it's not just from like gay and lesbian bar owners in Fort Lauderdale. It is from all sorts of different business leaders across the state. And I still cannot believe that the state of Florida is led by a governor who went after Walt Disney World, of all things. I mean, talk about the stupidest thing you could ever do as a political leader
Yeah.
in a state to go after its major employer like that. And certainly the thing that, in the American imagination is, deeply connected together. And then I think like the other thing we haven't said yet is climate change. So that also is a political issue in Florida that I think is sort of messing up, these easy partisan categories. As South Florida is underwater constantly as the coast is threatened, which is where development and the wealth of the state is. And you have a governor who has removed the words climate change from all state documents.
Hmm.
So there's another thing that's being removed from the public record and from, the sort of official leadership positions. That is not playing well with people who actually own property and who are, trying to make their businesses viable in a state that is very vulnerable to the ravages of climate change.
Yeah, well, and you're a property owner in Florida, and your family owns property in Florida. And so, one of the big issues is insurance, and
Yeah.
that there are a lot of people who are simply choosing not to insure anymore because it's so expensive and it's so difficult to get anyone to pay.
Yeah, and that just feels like a house of cards that hopefully, I just can't even imagine the catastrophe of that when it collapses. But we're just one, natural disaster away from that being a really, really bad situation in the state of Florida. And of course, Florida is a state that, sees a lot of natural disasters every year.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to the election. The Harris campaign is, in fact, making Florida a priority. This week, they launched a barrage of ads, specifically in the Mar a Lago viewing area, which I thought was wonderful. Women for Harris rallied in Tampa last weekend, and Tim Walz is doing a fundraiser in Florida this week. So I have a theory about this, which
Hmm.
is on the one hand, there's the old Howard Dean 50 state strategy that you fight in every state no matter what. But what happens when you fight in a state that your opponent didn't expect you to fight in? They all of a sudden have to reallocate money to defend that state. And I kind of think we're in a sort of all quiet on the Western Front situation in Florida here, which is actually Trump is going to have to divert money into Florida that he did not expect to have to spend.
Yeah, and that's what I was sort of getting at earlier when I said, now Florida is in play at least as an election battleground state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, we should say Florida is not a cheap state to spend those dollars in, right? I
Right.
mean, it's not New York, it's not California, but it's one of the most expensive media markets in the country, especially South Florida. If
Right.
that's where they're going to have to like do this work, we're talking about a very expensive media market, and so for them to be sort of on the back of their heels and like now realizing they have to go back into Florida and do something, I think that that is not something that the Trump team was expecting. Certainly, probably not where they were earmarking their money for. And I think that the other thing, though, that is sort of the part of this that we haven't fully talked about, though, is again this voter registration issue. It's great that the Harris campaign is feeling like, the Florida TV market is something worth investing in. But the local Democratic Party has done no investment in voter registration. And so this to me
Right.
feels like this enormous disconnect between national party operations and on the ground, you know, uh, party building stuff that the
Right.
Florida Democratic Party should be doing. And I don't understand why there has been no effort towards voter registration in a state where the population is changing so constantly.
Yeah, and I think one thing that historians will probably look at in the future is whether 2016 is that tipping point,
Yeah.
because at least Donna Brazil's account of the election, the Clinton campaign more or less cut Florida loose. They were so sure that they were going to win Florida that they didn't invest in it at all. Organizers were calling and saying, we need lawn signs. Sorry, no lawn signs. We need money for gas. Sorry, no money for gas. And that may have been a sort of breaking point that can only be repaired over time. I also want to just sort of toss in my own home state, Pennsylvania. I was down there earlier this week. I did not see a single Trump sign in the Philadelphia suburbs around where my mother lives. Not
Hmm.
one. And
Interesting.
that's new. That's
Yeah.
new. And it doesn't mean there aren't Trump voters, but if they're not getting their signs out, there's something a little wrong with their canvassing operation.
Mm.
So, Neil, we're going to move to the portion of the show where we each have something that we want to go viral this week. What do you want to go viral this week, Neil?
What I want to go viral this week, this is a little bit early on it, but I feel like let's make it go viral before it's really out in the world. I'm going to hold it up here. It's this new book by Paul Renfro, The Life and Death of Ryan White, AIDS and Inequality in America. It doesn't come out until October, so I have an advanced copy here. It is a fantastic book. You can go ahead and pre-order it on Amazon, which, helps authors a lot. I encourage people to do it. Paul is a fantastic historian, a really interesting thinker. And he has a wonderful first book, which was called Stranger Danger, which is about sort of not sort of, it's about kidnapping and the modern carceral state and the sort of moral panic around missing children in the 1980s and 90s. This is a very slim book, but a very impactful one. That's essentially a biography of Ryan White, who I think many viewers will remember became famous when in 1985 he, as a Indiana schoolboy, contracted HIV through contaminated blood products. He was a hemophiliac and got it in a transfusion. And the biography talks about how this very sort of unlikely person of Ryan White became this enormous national celebrity, really, in the height of the HIV/AIDS years crisis of the 1980s, how celebrities sort of rallied to him, and all of this was because he was kicked out of his public school in Indiana. He was not allowed to go back to school because he'd contracted HIV. And so it's just a really interesting and really beautiful portrait of Ryan White, and his story, but also this really interesting point Paul makes about how Ryan was perceived as innocent because he contracted HIV sort of through no fault of his own, and how in a lot of ways he his story and his biography and his public prominence brought about a sort of more compassionate attitude towards the HIV/AIDS crisis in this year, but also because he was perceived as innocent and having contracted the disease through no fault of his own. That, in a lot of ways, reinforced this notion that there were certain populations that were guilty for having contracted it and for spreading the virus. And of course, those were homosexual men. So anyway, I think it's a really wonderful book. It's a thin book; you can read through it really quickly, but I think an important one, especially now as we continue to think about the history of HIV/AIDS, what it means today in terms of national policy and sort of just national ideas about illness and inequality, and all the more resonant, I think, in our COVID moment. So check it out. Go ahead and pre-order it on Amazon, and it'll show up on your doorstep sometime in October. But congrats to Paul for this really nice book.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Neil. I've actually read a preprint too, and I think it's astonishing. And I think one of the other things that our viewers are going to see is that there was viral misinformation before the internet.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the interesting things about it, is that, people were sort of trading misinformation wildly, and wild rumors were flying about
Mm-hmm.
this child and about the disease. And, that was happening way before the internet. And it should cause us to, take a look at digital media and say, hey, how much of this is really new and how much of it was actually transported onto just a faster medium?
Yeah.
Um, so thanks for that, Neil. What I'd like to have go viral this week is an article in The Atlantic by Arash Azizi called "Is a New Palestinian Movement Being Born?" And it's about the uncommitted movement. I'll
Mm.
link to it in the show notes. And it's Azizi's meditation on the arrival of uncommitted at the Democratic National Convention, and how it is actually outlining a kind of progressive politics that is not about confrontation, that is not about shaming, that is not about cancel culture, but is about working the system. And he really gives us a way to understand how very experienced politicians like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and Pramila Jayapal were able to promote their support for the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza and their revulsion for what is happening, but also to do so in a way that doesn't close down political channels. And I actually thought it was very interesting when I was seeing reports of the uncommitted movement's various attempts to demonstrate and so on. There was a sit-in outside. Ocasio Cortez stopped by. Rashida Tlaib stopped by, but they didn't spend the night with them,
Mm.
right? And so there seems to be this kind of tutelage going on between more conventional political actors and the movement on behalf of displaced and you know, Palestinians who have had horrific amounts of violence done to them and done to their homes. To say, actually, maybe all of these encampments and the boycott, divest, sanction movement and all this, it hasn't really moved the needle. So maybe it's time to get back in the halls of Congress. And part of why I think is it's interesting about this is you really see this around gay activists too. When gay activists come into the Carter administration and say, look, we know you're not going to pass a national protection for lesbian and gay people, but you know what? You could remove a lot of civil service bans that
Right.
force people to serve secretly.
Yep.
Similarly, ACT UP possibly one of the most radical gay movements there has ever been, developed something called the Treatment Action Group that began to work with the FDA and work with Anthony Fauci to change the system. And those systems are with us today. I mean, the only reason we got vaccines for COVID as quickly as we did was because of the work that was done by the Treatment Action Group to change that system. So I heartily recommend Arash Azizi's piece in The Atlantic. He's really a wonderful writer, but it's also an extremely thoughtful piece that tries to hold the idea of a Palestinian movement in the same thought as traditional forms of democracy that move us forward incrementally.
That article is one of the many open tabs on my browser right now. And maybe now I'll just use your summary as a way of counting that article having been read and close it. But no, I want to read it too because I've been hearing good things about it online.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes, but you're right. You've already read it now that you've heard about it. So I want to tell our viewers that this is being recorded before the big interview that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are doing tonight. So, Neil, we've got to go and get our beauty sleep so that we can stay up beyond 9 o'clock. Oh my God, you're in California. You'll see it at
Works
6.
for me. Yep.
Oh God.
I'll
All
watch it
right.
on delay later.
All right. So we're going to be watching that tonight, and maybe we'll come back to it next week.
Sounds good.
All right, Neil, a pleasure as always.
Always. Thank you for having me.